Under blinding studio lights, a famous atheist talk show host mocks Keanu Reeves' faith before a roaring crowd. She expects outrage, but instead, he stays silent, fingers resting on his cross. Seconds later, something happens on live television that leaves millions speechless and forces even her to question everything she thought she knew about belief. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The lights of Los Angeles shimmered through the massive studio windows as hundreds of people filled the seats. The energy was electric, the kind of restless excitement that usually meant something controversial was about to unfold. Camera operators moved with precision, setting angles. Assistants whispered instructions through earpieces. On the central stage, a sleek black desk reflected the glare of overhead spotlights. Behind it sat Madeline Cole, the queen of late-night sarcasm. Her reputation was infamous, built on humor that cut deep, interviews that often ended in tears, and a smirk that could silence any guest who took her too seriously. The audience cheered as theme music blared. Madeline straightened her blazer, her signature confidence radiating through every movement. Her producers stood behind the camera, exchanging looks filled with anticipation. They'd planned this moment for weeks, a test of control, a provocation that would trend within hours. "Remember," one whispered through her earpiece, "stay light, stay funny, push him just enough." She gave a subtle nod, already knowing how far she could go. She was a master at this game. The big screen above the stage flickered with an image of Keanu Reeves. Clips of his movies played in quick succession: explosions, motorcycles, hero shots, the familiar action star montage. The audience roared with applause as the announcer's voice boomed. "Ladies and gentlemen, he's an actor, producer, and motorcycle lover, a living legend. Please welcome Keanu Reeves." A low hum of excitement rippled across the room as Keanu appeared at the edge of the stage. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or flashing lights. He walked slowly, calmly, wearing dark jeans, a simple black jacket, and a faded gray t-shirt. Around his neck hung a small cross, understated yet unmistakable under the brightness. He nodded politely to the cheering crowd, his steps unhurried, his smile soft and genuine. Madeline extended her hand across the desk with practiced charm. "Keanu, welcome," she said brightly, her tone playful. "I'm shocked we got you to come out of whatever quiet monastery you've been hiding in." The audience laughed. Keanu chuckled lightly, not defensive, simply amused. "No monastery," he replied gently, "just home." The first minutes of conversation were easy. Madeline teased him about his minimalism, his lack of social media, his reputation for riding the subway. Keanu answered every question with kindness, his voice steady, his words thoughtful. The crowd relaxed, laughing when he shared stories of fixing his own motorcycle or buying lunch for a film crew. The tone was warm, almost friendly. But Madeline's eyes glimmered with calculation. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "You're a grounded guy, Keanu, almost too calm. Tell me, is there anything that still shakes you? Anything that keeps you up at night?" Keanu paused for a moment, eyes lowering slightly. "I think," he said softly, "the same things that shake everyone: loss, love, and trying to stay kind." The audience murmured in approval. It was a good answer, humble, safe, but Madeline wasn't satisfied. She smiled sweetly, her tone shifting just a little sharper. "Interesting," she said, "because I've always thought faith was what people use to make loss easier to swallow. Would you say that's true for you?" The question hung in the air like a thin blade. Keanu didn't answer right away. He simply looked at her, not with offense, but with quiet patience, as if giving her time to reconsider her own words. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the faint flicker of emotion behind his stillness. He wasn't avoiding the question. He was choosing how to respond, or whether he should at all. The crowd, sensing the tension, grew quieter. Madeline leaned back in her chair, pretending to laugh it off, but there was a spark in her eyes that said she wanted to push further. She always did. Madeline's laughter echoed lightly across the studio, but it sounded more like a challenge than amusement. The audience chuckled along, unsure whether they should feel entertained or uncomfortable. That was her specialty, finding the line between humor and cruelty, then stepping 1 inch past it to see who would flinch. "So tell me, Keanu," she continued, her tone deceptively casual. "You've been through so much loss. Your best friend, your partner, your child. You've seen death up close. Do you really believe there's someone up there watching over you?" She raised an eyebrow, pausing just long enough for the tension to grow. "Or are you just hoping there is?" The crowd gave a soft, uneasy laugh, but even the sound techs noticed the energy shift. The playfulness of the opening minutes had vanished. Keanu sat perfectly still, his posture relaxed, yet his presence filled the room like quiet thunder. He didn't frown. He didn't look angry. He simply folded his hands together in his lap and looked down at the cross around his neck. The camera zoomed closer. The small silver cross glinted under the lights, swaying gently as he breathed. His thumb brushed across its surface in a simple, unperformed gesture, one that said more than any argument could. Madeline's smirk faltered. The silence stretched too long. She glanced toward her producer off camera, who gestured for her to keep going. She cleared her throat. "You know," she said, regaining her performative tone, "people say faith makes you strong. Personally, I think it makes people blind. Don't you think?" Keanu finally looked up. His eyes were steady, unreadable. He didn't interrupt or raise his voice. He simply met her gaze with calm that felt almost ancient. When he spoke, it was barely above a whisper, yet every word carried. "Maybe strength isn't about having all the answers," he said. "Maybe it's about trusting when you don't." The audience froze. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a single laugh. It was as if the air had been pulled out of the room. Madeline blinked, her confidence wavering for the first time that night. She tried to reply, but her throat tightened. "That's poetic," she said weakly, forcing a chuckle. "But we're talking about the real world, not movie scripts." Keanu didn't respond. He just smiled faintly, as if to say he understood something she didn't need to. The moment stretched into silence again, long enough for everyone watching to feel the weight of it. Then the studio lights dimmed slightly as the director prepared for a commercial break. The audience clapped, though uncertainly, unsure what they had just witnessed. Madeline turned away, straightening her notes, but her hands trembled slightly. Keanu glanced toward her, his demeanor unchanged, calm, patient, kind. And though not a single word had been spoken in anger, everyone in that room could feel it. The show had shifted. Something deeper was unfolding, and no one, not even Madeline, knew where it was heading next. As the commercial music faded, the camera zoomed back in. Madeline fixed her makeup with a trembling hand and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The studio lights felt hotter now, as if they were punishing her for losing control of her own show. She could sense that the audience wasn't there to laugh anymore. They were watching to understand. Something had shifted beneath the surface, and though she couldn't name it, she felt its weight pressing on her chest. She tried to recover her rhythm, her voice slightly higher than before. "All right," she said, glancing at her cue cards. "Let's talk about your new project." The words sounded hollow. She looked up to find Keanu still sitting quietly, posture relaxed, expression peaceful. It was disarming. He didn't gloat, didn't seem triumphant, he simply was, the kind of calm that can't be rehearsed. For a split second, their eyes met. She expected him to look away. Instead, he held her gaze, steady, unshaken. It wasn't defiance, it was empathy. The kind of look that saw right through the performance and into the person. Madeline's throat tightened. She quickly broke eye contact, pretending to check her notes again. The audience sat in utter stillness. Even the air felt different. A few people in the front row whispered to one another, uncertain of whether to clap or stay silent. It was no longer a comedy show. It had become something else, something raw, honest, and strange. The director gave a subtle cue to end the segment. The theme music swelled again, a forced return to normalcy. Madeline smiled toward the camera, her voice just slightly unsteady. "We'll be right back after this," she said. But as soon as the red light blinked off, she exhaled deeply, her professional armor cracking for a moment. Keanu turned slightly toward her and gave a gentle nod, the same kind of gesture one gives to someone standing on fragile ground. No words, no judgment, just acknowledgement. And in that quiet space between segments before the next lights came back on, before the laughter and sound returned, Madeline realized something she hadn't expected. The real story wasn't the one she was trying to create. It was the one unfolding right in front of her. In the stillness of a man who refused to fight hate with more noise, the music faded again and the cameras resumed. The red light blinked on, signaling the return to live broadcast. Madeline straightened her posture, her earlier composure not quite recovered but hidden behind her trained television smile. The crowd clapped obediently as the familiar rhythm of the show returned, but something felt off. The laughter was delayed, the applause thinner. Even the air in the studio seemed heavier than before. "Welcome back," Madeline said cheerfully, her voice slightly higher than usual. "We're here with the legendary Keanu Reeves." She turned to face him, her grin tightening. "We've been talking about your new movie, your life, and apparently your quiet sense of inner peace." The audience chuckled on cue, but it was the kind of laugh that came from habit, not amusement. Keanu smiled gently. "Peace isn't something I have," he said. "It's something I try to choose. Every day." Madeline leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. Her eyes glimmered again, sharper now. "Interesting," she said. "See, I think peace is a form of denial. People say they've found peace when they've stopped asking questions. But I like questions. Questions are honest. Faith feels like pretending not to know the truth." The audience gave a nervous laugh, unsure how to respond. A few clapped out of instinct. Keanu stayed silent, his expression soft but unreadable. Madeline tilted her head, testing him. "I mean, heaven?" she said with a smirk. "Isn't that just a bedtime story for adults afraid of endings? I get it. It's comforting to believe there's something more. But life ends. That's the point. Don't you think?" The laughter that followed sounded uneasy. A few people exchanged looks. Some smiled, others didn't. The cameras captured everything. The subtle discomfort, the flicker of doubt crossing the faces of those who weren't sure they should be laughing at all. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He shifted slightly in his chair, his hand brushing against the small silver cross hanging from his neck. The studio lights reflected off it, catching the camera's eye for a fleeting moment. His movements were slow, deliberate, never forced. It wasn't the gesture of someone performing. It was instinct, a habit formed over years of finding strength in stillness. Madeline watched him closely. She wanted a reaction, a debate, a clash, something she could control. But Keanu gave her nothing. The silence was heavier than any comeback could have been. She laughed again, louder this time, trying to reclaim the energy. "What's the matter, Keanu? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too polite to tell me I'm wrong." Keanu looked at her, calm as ever. His eyes carried no anger, only depth. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Then he said quietly, "Sometimes silence says more than words can." The room froze. The laughter stopped mid-breath. Even Madeline hesitated, her mouth still slightly open. The next line lost somewhere between her thoughts and her pride. The silence that followed was unlike any the studio had ever experienced. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. It was complete. Hundreds of people sat frozen in their seats, all eyes fixed on Keanu Reeves, who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved, and yet had somehow shifted the entire atmosphere with a single sentence. Madeline blinked rapidly, unsure of how to proceed. She looked toward the producers behind the cameras, searching for a cue, but none came. Even they seemed caught in the moment. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the walls themselves had begun listening. Finally, she forced a laugh, the kind that cracked around the edges. "Well," she said, her voice echoing awkwardly, "that's very philosophical. She straightened her stack of note cards with trembling fingers. "But we're not here to get deep, are we? We're here to talk about life, movies, motorcycles, fun stuff." The crowd chuckled weakly, grateful for the permission to make noise again. The relief was brief. Madeline leaned forward, trying to regain control of her show. "You know, Keanu," she said with renewed sharpness. "You keep talking about peace and silence, but you've lived through things that would break most people. Loss, grief, tragedy, and yet you say you believe in something beyond all that?" She smiled thinly. "Don't you think maybe it's just luck that you're still here?" Keanu's expression didn't change. His hands rested lightly on his knees. He took a slow breath and looked straight into her eyes. "If I'm still standing after everything," he said quietly, "it wasn't luck." 5 seconds passed. The audience didn't move. Someone in the back whispered something, but even that sound was swallowed by the silence. Madeline's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. The director, sensing the growing tension, made a quick decision and gestured to cut for a commercial. The theme music began playing over the speakers, filling the void with artificial cheer. The audience clapped on command, but their faces were pale, uncertain. As the red light on the main camera dimmed, Madeline exhaled deeply and rubbed her temples. "He's good," she muttered under her breath. "Too good." One of the producers leaned in from behind the camera. "Keep pushing," he whispered. "We need him to react. Don't let it stay flat." Madeline nodded slowly, but something inside her hesitated. She had hosted hundreds of episodes filled with laughter, outrage, and scandal, yet none of them had felt like this. For the first time in years, she felt her own words losing power. Keanu sat silently as makeup artists rushed in to dab his forehead. He didn't need fixing. He looked serene, unbothered, whole. When the cameras came back, everyone would be expecting another laugh. But what they were about to get was something entirely different, something that would mark the beginning of the show's unraveling. When the cameras returned, the applause sign flashed above the audience, but only a handful of people clapped. The rest sat stiff, watching. The host smiled on cue, her expression perfectly trained, though her voice carried a faint tremor. "We're back with Keanu Reeves," she said, forcing a bright tone. "And things just got a little serious." Keanu smiled faintly, not to ease the tension, but out of quiet respect. "Serious can be good," he said softly. "It means people are listening." The crowd gave a hesitant chuckle. Madeline took a deep breath and forced a laugh. "Listening, sure," she replied. "But not everyone likes what they hear." She leaned forward, trying to reassert control. "You know, some people would say you've survived a lot because of resilience, not faith. That it's your strength, not some invisible force, that's kept you standing." Keanu tilted his head, thoughtful. "Maybe strength and faith aren't opposites," he said. "Maybe they work together. Maybe faith is what gives strength meaning." The studio fell silent again. The producer offstage waved for more energy, but the audience didn't move. Their faces were drawn, contemplative. They weren't watching a talk show anymore. They were watching a conversation they didn't expect to matter. Madeline's hands curled slightly on the desk. She wanted to interrupt, to mock him again, but her words felt heavy now. Instead, she asked softly, "And what about the people who lose everything and never find peace? Are they just unlucky?" Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said quietly. "They're human, and being human means you keep walking, even when you don't understand why." A faint murmur spread through the audience. A woman in the third row wiped her eyes. Madeline looked down, swallowing hard. Her cue card suddenly looked meaningless. The director's voice came through her earpiece, urging, "Wrap it up. Commercial in 10 seconds." She nodded mechanically, forcing a smile. "We'll be right back after this short break," she said, her voice trembling just enough for the microphone to catch. The theme music swelled, but the clapping was hollow. As the cameras powered down, Madeline stared at Keanu. He sat peacefully, hands folded, eyes distant but kind. No one spoke. Not the producers, not the audience, not the crew. And for a few seconds, the entire studio stood in the kind of silence that can't be rehearsed or edited, one that lingers because it means something deeper has just been heard. The commercial break faded to black, but instead of returning to laughter or bright lights, the screen slowly filled with muted colors. The music softened into a low hum, almost like a heartbeat. A faint breeze moved through a graveyard lined with pale stone markers. Keanu stood alone beneath a gray sky, his long black coat brushing against his knees. His hair was damp from drizzle, his eyes distant, heavy with memory. In front of him rested a small headstone marked only with a single name and a date. He didn't move, he didn't speak. His hands were in his pockets, but the faint rise and fall of his shoulders betrayed what words could not pain that had never truly left. The camera lingered on his face, showing neither tears nor anger, only a depth that comes from years of carrying grief with quiet endurance. The image shifted. A flicker of light replaced the gray scene, revealing a small apartment years earlier. His mother, Patricia, sat at a kitchen table with a candle in front of her. The flame danced against a framed photograph of a young Keanu, smiling beside his sister. Patricia closed her eyes, whispering a prayer only the candlelight heard. Outside, faint rain tapped against the glass. That small moment, unseen by anyone else, was faith humble, unannounced, real. Then, another image emerged. The rumble of a subway train echoed through the tunnel. Keanu sat on a corner seat, surrounded by commuters lost in their own worlds. He wore a dark hoodie, head tilted slightly down, a paperback open in his lap. He wasn't reading it. His gaze drifted toward the reflection in the train window, his own eyes staring back, tired but aware. Across from him, a woman clutched a bouquet of white lilies. Her fingers trembled, her eyes red from crying. Keanu noticed, then slowly removed a tissue from his pocket and handed it to her with a gentle nod. No words, just kindness. The film cut to another day, a hospital corridor, fluorescent lights humming overhead. A nurse's voice filled the soundscape. He was sitting in the waiting room, quiet. No cameras, no entourage. I recognized him, but he didn't act famous. My mom was in the same ward. He brought coffee to every nurse on the floor and didn't even say why. The voice cracked slightly, filled with gratitude. He just smiled and said, "You all take care of the people who matter most. That's not small." The image shifted again, Keanu, in a dimly lit church. The pews were empty, except for him. Outside, dusk had painted the sky a deep violet. A single candle flickered near the altar, and its light fell gently on his face. His eyes were closed. He didn't fold his hands. He didn't kneel. He simply sat, breathing slowly, still. That silence, that stillness, said more than any sermon could. The faint hum of the subway faded into another voice. A rideshare driver spoke as the screen showed a car gliding through downtown Los Angeles at night, the city lights blurring across the windshield. "He got in my car after midnight," the driver said. "Quiet guy, polite. I didn't realize who he was until halfway through the ride. I told him my daughter wanted to go to film school, but we couldn't afford it. He didn't say much, just listened. When we reached his stop, I looked down at the app and saw he'd tipped me $500. I thought it was a mistake." He smiled and said, "It's not a mistake. She deserves a chance. Tell her to keep going." The image lingered on the driver's eyes, glistening in the mirror. The scene faded into another sunlight spilling through a gas station window. A woman stood beside her overheated car, steam rising from under the hood. She looked defeated, hands on her hips. From the corner of the frame, Keanu walked into view, dressed simply, carrying a bottle of water and a rag. He spoke softly to her, then knelt beside the car, unafraid of the grease or the heat. The woman's voice played over the footage. "He didn't just help," she said. "He stayed. He stayed for an hour, trying to fix a stranger's engine on his day off. And when it wouldn't start, he called a tow truck and paid for it himself." The music deepened, low piano notes echoing like distant thunder. Another voice entered, a man with a trembling accent. "My brother needed surgery," he said. "The hospital called, said the bill was covered. We thought it was a miracle. Later, a nurse told us it was him. He didn't even leave a name. Images of quiet moments filled the screen. Keanu walking alone through a park, feeding birds in winter, sitting on a park bench, sharing half his sandwich with a homeless man, waiting at a red light, smiling at a child waving from the next car. There was no spotlight, no cameras, no noise, just presence. Then the screen dimmed again, returning to the church at dusk. The candles flickered along the altar. Keanu sat motionless, head bowed, the faint outline of the cross visible against his chest. The camera slowly drew closer. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping lightly on the stained glass windows. His lips moved, barely, as if speaking a word only he could hear. He wasn't praying for success. He wasn't asking for rescue. He was remembering the people, the losses, the love that never left. His silence was not emptiness. It was faith made visible. The camera lingered on Keanu's face as the rain outside softened to a whisper. A candle beside him flickered, casting thin shadows across the church walls. In that dim light, his features looked older, not from age, but from endurance. He opened his eyes slowly, looking up at the crucifix ahead. His breathing steadied. It wasn't a moment of revelation. It was a moment of remembering who he had always been, a man still standing. Not because life had been gentle, but because he never stopped believing in something greater than his pain. As the soft piano melody swelled, the images shifted once again. A montage of real people appeared, faces from different places, stitched together by their stories. The nurse, the driver, the woman at the gas station, all of them watching the broadcast, remembering their brief encounters with him. Each had a similar expression: quiet awe. None of them had realized at the time that those moments were connected. But now, seeing him on television, facing mockery with calm grace, they understood. His kindness had never been about fame. It was about faith, the kind that never demands recognition. One final voice entered, gentle and reflective. Some people speak their beliefs, it said, but others live them. The screen showed Keanu walking along a narrow street at dusk, his jacket collar turned up against the wind. The camera followed as he stepped into a small church, the doors creaking softly behind him. Inside, the only light came from candles left by strangers, tiny flames of hope flickering in the still air. Keanu moved quietly between the pews and sat again in the same place as before, his head bowed, the cross glinting faintly in the candlelight. For a long moment, he didn't move. His silence filled the screen. Then, just before the music faded, a single line appeared on screen, written in white against the darkness. He carried pain not as punishment, but as prayer. Back in the studio, as the images faded and the lights came up, the audience sat in absolute stillness. Madeline stared at the monitor beside her, where the montage had just played. The smug confidence she wore so easily was gone. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Her fingers traced the edge of her cue cards, but her mind wasn't on the show anymore. Something in the footage had unsettled her. Not guilt, not embarrassment, but recognition. The cameras turned back toward her and Keanu. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was sacred, and everyone in the room could feel it. The studio lights came up again, sharper, colder than before. The sound of applause filled the air, but it felt mechanical, hollow, like an echo of something that used to be alive. Madeline Cole adjusted her jacket, her lips stretched into a rehearsed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd spent the break pacing behind the curtain, convincing herself she was still in control. This was her show, her audience, her stage. But as she sat across from Keanu once more, that conviction wavered. The segment opened with light banter, a desperate attempt to restore normalcy. She asked about his new film, his motorcycle collection, even cracked a joke about his quiet lifestyle. The crowd laughed politely, but underneath the noise, something had shifted. The usual rhythm of control and ridicule wasn't there. Keanu answered gently, his calm presence steadying the air around them. The more composed he remained, the more uncertain Madeline became. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "You wear a cross," she said, her eyes narrowing as they caught the silver glint beneath the studio lights. "Isn't that just fashion?" A few people in the audience gave hesitant laughs, but it was forced, strained. The camera zoomed in, capturing the faint shimmer of the necklace against Keanu's chest. He didn't move right away. His fingers brushed the cross lightly, almost tenderly, before he lifted his gaze back to her. "No," he said softly. "It's memory, forgiveness, survival." The words hung in the air like a single note that refused to fade. Every person in that studio felt them. It wasn't an actor's line. It wasn't a clever rebuttal. It was truth, raw and unpolished. Madeline's smile faltered. She looked away for a second, pretending to shuffle her cue cards. "That's poetic," she said, forcing a chuckle. "You always talk like that, or just when the cameras are on?" Keanu smiled faintly. Not offended, not defensive, only when people ask questions that matter. The audience murmured softly, an involuntary sound, half gasp, half breath. The energy in the room began to tilt again, slipping out of Madeline's hands. She tried to laugh, but the sound cracked slightly. "You realize not everyone buys into that kind of thing," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "Some of us prefer to live in the real world." Keanu's eyes met hers again. "Faith doesn't take you out of the real world," he replied. "It helps you face it." The crowd erupted in a hushed silence. No applause, no laughter, just stillness. Even the cameramen hesitated to move, as if breaking the moment would somehow feel wrong. Madeline leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, trying to regain the upper hand. But inside, her pulse was racing. This wasn't how her interviews went. She was supposed to control the tone, lead the rhythm. Yet now, she could feel herself following his. Madeline's laughter returned, but it sounded thinner now, like a thread stretched too tight. She leaned on her elbow, trying to look casual, but her posture betrayed her. "You're really committed to this, huh?" she said with a smirk that didn't fully form. "Faith, forgiveness, survival. It sounds poetic, but isn't it really just a way to avoid reality? You talk about pain as if it's a teacher, but for most people, it just hurts." Keanu listened quietly. He didn't interrupt or rush to answer. That silence unnerved her even more than a heated argument would have. She was used to people defending themselves, pushing back, but he just let her words hang there, waiting for them to lose their power. When he finally spoke, his tone was soft but unwavering. "Pain does hurt," he said, "and it doesn't stop hurting. But what you do with that pain, that's where faith begins. It's not pretending things are good. It's believing they still can be." A low murmur rippled through the audience. Someone clapped once, uncertainly, before quickly stopping. The crowd wasn't sure how to react, but they were feeling something, an unfamiliar weight pressing against their hearts. Madeline forced a smile, but her voice wavered slightly. "You make it sound so simple," she said, pretending to scribble a note on her cue card. "But people lose their jobs, their families, their lives. You think believing in something makes all that okay?" Keanu's gaze softened. "No," he said. "It doesn't make it okay. It helps you keep walking until it is." The simplicity of his response hit harder than any debate could have. The studio fell silent again. Even the producer in the control room hesitated before switching camera angles. Madeline tapped her pen against her note card, trying to stay composed. Her fingers trembled slightly, and she noticed. She clenched them into a fist beneath the desk. "You're not exactly giving me headlines here, Keanu," she said, forcing her voice into its old teasing tone. "Faith, hope, walking through pain sounds more like a sermon than an interview." He tilted his head slightly, still calm. "Maybe sometimes people need a reminder, not a headline." That line wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't clever. It was sincere, and that sincerity disarmed her completely. She didn't have a script for sincerity. A light flashed at the back of the room, signaling 5 minutes to commercial. The audience sat in near silence, their attention locked not on entertainment, but on something deeper, more human. Madeline looked out across the rows of faces and felt her chest tighten. These people weren't laughing anymore. They were listening to him, and to something inside themselves. She turned back toward Keanu and saw him watching her quietly, patient as ever. It was that patience that shook her. The way he waited without judgment, as if he already knew she'd eventually drop the act. And in that moment, a thought flickered through her mind, one she immediately tried to push away. Maybe he wasn't the one being tested tonight. Maybe she was. The red light on the camera blinked again, signaling they were still live, but neither of them moved. The audience barely breathed. Madeline glanced toward the monitor beside her, trying to find her reflection, to ground herself in something familiar, but even her own image looked foreign. She was supposed to be the one leading the show, yet somehow, without trying, Keanu had shifted the entire gravity of the room. She cleared her throat, forcing out a brittle laugh. "So," she said, pretending to look at her cue cards again, "faith, forgiveness, survival, sounds like a trilogy waiting for a movie deal." A few laughs trickled through the audience, weak and delayed. Keanu smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said, "but I think the story's already being written. We're all part of it." Madeline blinked, caught off guard by the gentleness in his voice. It wasn't a line. It was an invitation. She tried to recover, forcing a smirk. "And in your story, what happens to the people who stop believing?" He didn't hesitate. "They get found anyway." Something in that answer made her chest tighten. She stared at him for a moment, trying to speak, but the words didn't come. Her instinct as a host told her to pivot, to pull back to safer ground, but her heart felt pinned in place. The control room counted down in her earpiece 2 minutes to break, but she didn't hear them. She sat there, face to face with the man she'd invited to be a spectacle, realizing he had become a mirror instead. The audience could sense her unraveling. The same people who had laughed at her opening jokes now leaned forward silently, watching not the celebrity, but the dynamic between them, something raw, something real. Madeline exhaled softly and said, almost under her breath, "You really believe that, don't you?" Keanu's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't need to convince anyone else. I just need to live it." The producer gestured wildly for her to end the segment, but she didn't break eye contact. "We'll be right back," she finally said, her voice quiet, steady, but different now, stripped of mockery, stripped of armor. As the theme music played, Keanu reached for his glass of water, calm as ever. Madeline glanced down at her trembling hands and knew, deep down, that something inside her had already begun to crack. When the show returned from the break, the lights felt dimmer, though no one had touched the controls. Madeline's makeup artist had tried to refresh her smile during the commercial, but it didn't stick. The glow she normally carried, the biting confidence that made her famous, was gone. Her cue card sat on the desk, edges slightly bent from how tightly she'd been gripping them. "Welcome back," she said, voice soft and slightly uneven. "We're still here with Keanu Reeves." The crowd clapped politely, unsure of the mood they were supposed to carry. She looked toward the audience, then back at Keanu, searching for her usual rhythm, but the moment felt fragile. Her usual weapons, sarcasm, speed, control, no longer worked. She was left with the one thing she always avoided: honesty. "You know," she began slowly, "when I was little, I used to pray." Her words startled even her. They came out like a confession that had been waiting years for permission to exist. "Every night, actually, I'd close my eyes and talk to someone I couldn't see. I didn't even know what I was asking for." She gave a shaky laugh. "I guess I just thought that if I said the right words, something would change." The audience sat in silence. No laughter, no whispers. Even the crew froze. The camera zoomed slightly closer, framing her trembling hands and her distant stare. Madeline's throat tightened as she continued. But nothing ever happened. Not once. No miracles, no answers. Just silence. And eventually, I stopped trying. I told myself it was childish, that I'd grown up. But maybe she said softly, eyes glistening. Maybe I just gave up. Keanu didn't move. He sat still, hands resting lightly on his knees, his expression calm but filled with compassion. There was no trace of victory in his eyes, no sign that he felt he'd won something. He simply listened. The kind of listening that made her feel seen, not judged. Her lip trembled. I used to laugh at people who prayed, she said, voice cracking. Not because I hated them. I think I just hated that I couldn't believe like they did. Maybe I didn't laugh at your faith, Keanu. Maybe I laughed at my pain. The words spilled out and hung there in the stillness. A single tear slid down her cheek. The audience didn't dare move. Even the hum of the studio lights seemed quieter now, as though the whole building was listening. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice soft enough that it barely reached the microphones. No one who suffers while praying, he said, is ever alone. Madeline looked up, blinking through her tears, searching his eyes for something understanding, forgiveness, maybe both. What she found instead was peace. Madeline swallowed hard, her throat tightening around the weight of everything she had just said. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't for ratings. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing. She was remembering. The child she used to be, the one who knelt beside her bed whispering hopes into the dark, suddenly felt close again, so close she could almost hear her younger self asking why no one had ever answered back. She rubbed her palm across her face, trying to compose herself, but her voice quivered when she spoke. You know what's strange? She said softly. I built an entire career out of not believing in anything. People loved that about me. They thought it made me strong. But lately, her voice trailed off. She looked toward the audience, their faces pale, attentive. Lately, it just feels lonely. Keanu didn't look away. He gave a small nod, as if to tell her it was safe to keep going. Madeline let out a shaky breath. When my father died, she continued, everyone told me to pray. They said God had a plan. But what kind of plan lets people disappear like that? What kind of plan takes everything good and leaves you staring at a wall? Her hand gripped the edge of the desk. So I stopped. I stopped believing in anything I couldn't see. The audience remained silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the distant shuffle of a cameraman shifting his stance, but nothing else. No one wanted to break the spell that had fallen over the room. Keanu's voice entered the space gently, steady as a heartbeat. Maybe it's not about seeing, he said. Maybe it's about remembering that you're still here. Sometimes that's the proof. Madeline blinked rapidly, tears forming again. And what if you can't feel it? She whispered. What if you're so used to the silence that you don't know how to listen anymore? Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. Then maybe that's when faith begins, he said. When the silence stops being empty and starts being something that holds you instead. Her lower lip trembled. She tried to smile, but it fell away into something raw, truer. The lights from the stage reflected off the tear sliding down her cheek, catching the lens of the main camera. The director almost cut away, afraid it was too intimate, but something in the room told him not to. Keanu's eyes never left hers. His calm wasn't distant. It was present. Alive. The kind that pulled people in without a word. Madeline took a long breath, and her next words came out almost as a whisper. You really believe someone's listening, don't you? Keanu nodded once, even when we don't have the words for it. The silence that followed didn't feel heavy this time. It felt sacred. Madeline lowered her eyes, unable to hold his gaze any longer. Her cue cards lay scattered on the desk, useless now. The show, the cameras, the lights, all of it seemed to fade into the background. What remained was the sound of her own heartbeat and the strange calm that Keanu's words had left behind. For years, she'd spoken louder than everyone around. Her, certain that volume meant truth. But here he was, showing her that truth didn't always need to shout. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, asking for nothing in return. She pressed her fingertips against her temples and let out a long, trembling sigh. You know, she said quietly, When I walked out here tonight, I thought I was going to prove something. I thought I was going to show the world how ridiculous faith can be. But now I just tend." Her voice faltered. "I don't even know what I believe anymore." Keanu leaned slightly closer, his tone steady but gentle. "Maybe you don't have to know right now," he said. "Maybe it's enough to just be open again." She looked up slowly, her face streaked with tears she hadn't realized were there. "Open to what?" "To the possibility," he said. "That love doesn't end when we lose it. That pain doesn't mean abandonment. That silence doesn't mean no one's there." The words landed softly but deeply, echoing through the stillness of the room. The audience sat motionless, many holding their breath. It no longer felt like a talk show. It felt like something holy, a shared moment of surrender. Madeline nodded faintly, her shoulders slumping as if she'd been carrying something heavy for years and had finally set it down. "Maybe I've been angry for so long," she whispered. Angry at the silence, angry that no one ever answered back. Keanu gave a quiet smile. "Maybe you just didn't realize the answer was waiting in you." She closed her eyes for a moment, her lips trembling into a faint, broken smile. Then she wiped her tears, straightened herself, and faced him with something new in her expression, peace. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. He shook his head slightly. "Neither is faith." For several seconds, no one moved. Then the studio erupted into quiet applause, not wild or performative, but heartfelt. Some people in the audience wiped their own eyes. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried weight. And as the red recording light blinked off, Madeline realized the night hadn't gone wrong after all. It had gone exactly the way it needed to. Behind the shining stage lights, where the cameras didn't reach, the control room buzzed with quiet chaos. Producers whispered sharply into their headsets, their voices tight with frustration. The emotional moment between Madeline and Keanu had not been part of the plan. The show was supposed to be provocative, not transformative. Ratings had always been built on confrontation, not compassion. But what had just unfolded on live television was something entirely different, something they couldn't predict or control. One producer leaned closer to the director, whispering harshly, "Push the God angle. We need her to poke him again." The director frowned. "Are you sure? The audience is dead quiet." "Exactly," the producer snapped. "Quiet doesn't trend. We need reactions. Get her to push faith. Make him defend it." Madeline, of course, couldn't hear them. She sat on the main stage, still shaken from what she'd just confessed, trying desperately to regain her composure. Her cue cards were gone now, scattered off to the side. She had no script left to hide behind. When the red light blinked back on, she pasted on her professional smile, but her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. "All right," she said, clearing her throat. "That was quite a conversation." She forced a small laugh, hoping to draw the audience back into familiar territory. "Let's, shift gears a bit." Keanu smiled politely. "Of course." "So," she continued, scanning her notes, though she wasn't really reading them, "you've played heroes, fighters, even messiahs. But what about in real life? Do you ever feel pressured to be that kind of person off screen too?" It was a safe question, one meant to steer things back to the world of acting. But somehow, it still circled the same theme, the same question beneath the surface. Who are you when the world stops watching? Keanu tilted his head slightly thoughtful. "No," he said. "I don't feel pressured to be anyone. I just try to show up as myself. That's enough most days." Madeline nodded, trying to stay in rhythm. But her voice trembled slightly when she spoke again. "And that self," she said, "is someone who believes there's something greater out there?" The question wasn't meant to sound loaded, but it did. The words came out sharper than she intended, and the audience felt it. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Keanu paused, not to hesitate, but to give her space to hear what she had just said. Then he replied gently, "Yes, I believe there's something greater, and it doesn't need me to prove it." Madeline swallowed hard. She hadn't expected that kind of calm. The audience sensed it too. They weren't watching a celebrity interview anymore. They were witnessing a quiet dismantling of artifice, the kind that happens when truth refuses to stay hidden. In the control room, tension built like static before a storm. One of the assistant producers, a young man in a headset, whispered, "She's losing the tempo. He's too calm." Another replied, "Calm doesn't trend. We need controversy." The lead producer leaned forward, gripping the console. "Tell her to push again. Mention heaven. Challenge him. We need something strong before the final break." A stagehand moved toward the edge of the set and signaled Madeline with a subtle gesture. She caught it from the corner of her eye, her professional instinct kicking in even as her heart resisted. For a moment, she stared at the floor, then back at Keanu, who sat unbothered, waiting. She could almost hear her producer's voices in her head, telling her what kind of host she needed to be, the kind that stirred reactions, not reflection. She forced a light laugh and leaned forward again, mask slipping back into place. "Okay," she said, trying to sound amused. "So you believe there's something greater out there. But doesn't that ever feel like giving up responsibility? Like you're waiting for someone else to fix the world?" It was the kind of question designed to provoke, but the tone faltered halfway through. The words lacked the venom they were meant to carry. The audience felt it. No one laughed this time. Keanu looked at her with quiet empathy. "No," he said softly. "It's the opposite. Believing in something greater doesn't take away responsibility. It gives it meaning. You act, not because you think you'll fix everything, but because you believe it still matters." Madeline froze, his answer catching her off guard. The simplicity of it disarmed her completely. She glanced briefly at the audience. Rows of faces stared back, motionless, drawn in by the gravity of his calm. In the control room, someone muttered, "It's too soft. We're losing momentum." Another voice answered, "No, we're gaining something else." Madeline could feel it too. The tension wasn't about controversy anymore. It was about truth breaking through the script. She shifted in her seat, fingers brushing against the microphone wire hidden beneath her jacket. She was supposed to guide the show, to control the tone. But now the tone had a life of its own. The next words left her mouth almost unconsciously. "You really don't get angry, do you?" Keanu smiled gently. "I do. I just don't let anger decide what I say next." The audience exhaled softly, a few nodding without realizing it. It was as if he was speaking not just to her, but to everyone. Madeline blinked, staring at him. She didn't have a follow-up question prepared for that kind of peace. And behind the cameras, her producers finally went silent, realizing that no amount of scripting could compete with what was happening on its own. For a few long seconds, no one in the studio moved. The hum of the equipment filled the silence, but even that sound seemed softer now, as if the room itself had begun to listen. Madeline sat still, her cue cards forgotten again, her hands folded on the desk. She looked at Keanu and saw no trace of ego, no need to win, no hint of superiority, just patience. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "I don't know how you do that," she finally said quietly. "Sit here and let someone like me pick you apart." Keanu smiled faintly, his tone almost whisper soft. "You can't break something that's not trying to fight back." That line landed with quiet power. The audience shifted, many with their hands clasped in front of them as though they were in a place meant for reflection, not laughter. The energy in the studio had changed completely. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was transformation happening in real time. In the control room, the producers stared at the monitors, speechless. One of them finally muttered, "We can't cut this. It's too real." Another shook his head. "We didn't plan this, but maybe it's better than anything we ever planned." Madeline blinked away the blur of emotion welling behind her eyes. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "if maybe this," she gestured around the set, "the cameras, the bright lights, all of this, is the opposite of what you believe?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe it's not about the place, it's about the people in it. You can find light in a studio just like you can find it in silence. It's the same light. Madeline's eyes softened. She looked down at her notes one last time, then set them aside completely. "I think I've been chasing the wrong kind of light," she whispered. He gave a small, knowing nod. "The good news is, it never stops waiting for you." A faint tremor passed through her shoulders. It wasn't sadness. It was recognition. The audience remained perfectly still as the director's voice came through the headset, hesitant for the first time. "Go to break?" But no one moved to cut. The red light on the camera stayed on, the silence stretching out longer than protocol allowed. It wasn't an awkward silence, it was sacred. And though the producers didn't know it yet, the backstage recording of their earlier whispers, the one that urged Madeline to attack, was still rolling quietly in the background, ready to expose the truth about what had really been planned that night. The episode ended in silence. No grand farewell, no applause that faded into laughter, just quiet. When the credits rolled, the studio audience sat frozen for a moment before rising to their feet in slow, genuine applause, not for entertainment, but for truth. By the time the lights dimmed and the cameras stopped, Madeline and Keanu were still sitting there. She wiped her eyes discreetly and whispered a quiet thank you. He smiled, nodded once, and left the stage without another word. An hour later, the footage hit the network servers. Editors watched it in stunned silence. There was no dramatic climax, no scandal, no shouting match, just stillness and emotion. Some thought it was unusable. Others said it was brilliant. Within a few hours, the producers decided to air it as it was, uncut. They didn't know they were about to ignite something much larger than ratings. The show aired that night, across time zones. Millions tuned in, expecting the usual controversy, the usual laughter. Instead, they watched a host slowly unravel under the weight of her own cynicism and a man of faith quietly steady her without a single sermon. Viewers stayed until the final second, eyes locked on the screen as the credits rolled in silence. It was unlike anything television had seen in years. The internet erupted before the broadcast even finished. Short clips flooded social media. Keanu sitting calmly as she mocked faith. The moment she broke down, the line that silenced millions. No one who suffers while praying is ever alone. Within hours, the clips racked up millions of views. Comment sections overflowed. He didn't argue, but he won. This is how you answer hate, with grace. That silence was louder than any sermon. The hashtag number respect faith trended globally within the first 12 hours. It wasn't just about religion, it was about dignity. People began sharing personal stories in response. One user wrote, "I stopped praying years ago because people laughed at me. After tonight, I whispered again." Another said, "He reminded me that kindness doesn't need a microphone." Madeline's name trended too, but for very different reasons. Screenshots of her earlier sarcasm filled the internet, replayed and dissected. Some mocked her, others defended her vulnerability. Overnight, she went from feared media icon to public target. Thousands of angry comments flooded her feed, calling her cruel, heartless, broken. She didn't respond. She stayed offline, staring at her reflection in the dark window of her apartment, the glow of her phone lighting her face as messages piled up faster than she could read. Meanwhile, Keanu said nothing. No press statement, no interviews, no comments, not a single word. But what he did next would shape the entire narrative. The next morning, while news outlets were still scrambling to interpret what had happened, Keanu's name dominated every headline. Analysts called his composure a masterclass in restraint. Psychologists wrote articles about moral stillness and emotional intelligence. Faith leaders across denominations praised his humility. Even skeptics admitted that something in that broadcast had struck a nerve across belief systems. Every network wanted him for an interview. Reporters camped outside his Los Angeles home, microphones ready. His manager's phone rang non-stop. He didn't answer a single call. For 2 full days, the world speculated on what he would say next. But Keanu didn't say a word. On the third morning, his fans woke to a single post on his verified account. No caption, no hashtags. Just an image. It showed a small wooden table by a window, sunlight spilling across its surface. On it lay a closed, leather-bound book. Resting on top was his silver cross, the same one from the interview. The image was peaceful, simple, quiet. Beneath it, a single caption appeared. Sometimes silence is the answer. Within an hour, the post had more than 1 million likes. By noon, 5 million. People around the world shared it, quoting the caption as if it were scripture. News outlets called it a response without words. Comments poured in from every corner of the internet. This is what strength looks like. Silence speaks when ego can't. He didn't fight back, he rose above it. Artists painted it. Pastors referenced it. Teachers used it in classrooms. It became a symbol of dignity under ridicule, proof that calm could still win in a noisy world. But as Keanu's post spread, another kind of storm began brewing behind the scenes. Someone leaked an unedited clip from backstage, the private audio from the control booth that no one outside the production team was supposed to hear. The recording began, innocently enough, with producers giving time cues. Then came a voice. "Push the God angle," a man said. "Make him defend it. The more serious he gets, the better it'll play." Another voice replied, "You sure he won't snap?" "Exactly," the first voice answered. "He's polite. It'll make her look smart. We need the tension." The recording ended abruptly, but the damage was done. Within hours, it spread across every major platform. Hashtags exploded. Number faith trap, number truth leaked, number respect faith. The world now knew the interview had been orchestrated to humiliate him. Madeline's name was back in the headlines, this time under brutal headlines. The public outrage was relentless. News channels ran the leaked clip on repeat. Commentators accused the show of manipulation, of exploiting belief for profit. Sponsors began pulling out. And as the world tore her apart, Keanu remained silent. He didn't defend himself, didn't condemn anyone. His stillness was louder than all the noise surrounding him. By the end of the week, the leaked recording had become the most shared audio in the country. Even late-night comedians who normally thrived on ridicule paused to comment, admitting that this story felt different. People were angry, not because a celebrity had been mocked, but because something sacred had been manipulated for ratings. Madeline stayed out of sight. Her studio issued a statement calling the situation a misunderstanding, but no one believed it. The network's social media pages flooded with outrage. Former staff members began speaking out, confirming that these kinds of provocations were routine, part of an unspoken formula. It wasn't curiosity, they said. It was engineered conflict. For days, Keanu's name appeared beside words like dignity, peace, grace. Commentators compared his silence to a form of resistance, a reminder that sometimes the purest form of truth is refusing to play the game. The public saw the contrast clearly now, his calm against their chaos, his silence against their noise. Then, late one evening, a journalist posted a photo taken outside Keanu's home. It showed him stepping out to greet a delivery driver, handing him a tip and smiling. The caption read, "He's living the same way he spoke." That image went viral too, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Meanwhile, Madeline sat in her apartment, the glow of her phone screen the only light in the room. Comment after comment scrolled past anger, disappointment, pity. She wanted to fight back, to explain, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Every statement she rehearsed sounded hollow. She realized there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage. Across town, Keanu scrolled through the endless headlines in silence. He saw her name trending for the wrong reasons, saw the anger directed at her, and closed the screen. For a moment, he looked down at his cross resting against his chest, the same one that had become a symbol across the world. He opened his window, the night air cool against his skin. Somewhere below, city lights shimmered like distant stars. He whispered quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, "Let them find peace." Then he set his phone down and turned off the light. The world was still talking, still debating, still arguing, but he had already moved on. And though the noise outside grew louder, everyone who had seen that image of the cross on the closed book remembered something simple and powerful. The only voice that never loses strength is silence, that carries truth. Within days, the story had evolved beyond a simple viral clip. It became a conversation that stretched across cultures, faiths, and ideologies. Morning shows invited psychologists to analyze what they called moral stillness, the power of composure in an age addicted to outrage. Commentators on every network replayed the moment Keanu sat in silence after being mocked, calling it the turning point of modern media. Some called him a saint, others a mystery. But regardless of belief, nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The man had changed something in the air. Social media feeds filled with contrasting images. One showed Madeline's face mid-mockery, frozen in time. The other showed Keanu sitting quietly, hand resting on his cross, eyes calm. Underneath the split image, a caption read, "Two worlds, one truth." Another went viral. He didn't speak to win. He spoke to heal. Philosophers and writers joined the discussion. One columnist wrote, "Keanu reminded us that faith doesn't need applause, it needs integrity." Another said, "For a man mocked on national television, his greatest victory was not in words, but in restraint." Even those who didn't believe in any religion found themselves strangely moved. A well-known atheist author tweeted, "I don't share his faith, but I share his respect. The world could use more of that." The post received millions of likes. Meanwhile, faith leaders across traditions began referencing the interview in their sermons. A Christian pastor in Chicago spoke to his congregation saying, "That man showed what Christ meant by turning the other cheek." A rabbi in New York used the same clip to teach patience, calling it modern wisdom in motion. An imam in Cairo referenced Keanu's silence as the kind of humility prophets once carried. Clips of the interview replayed across continents. Translators dubbed it into dozens of languages. In India, Buddhist monks discussed it as an example of inner stillness. In Japan, a quiet tea ceremony was dedicated to his calm. Across the world, memes that once mocked celebrities turned into meditations about dignity, grief, and grace. Keanu, unaware of most of it, kept his daily rhythm the same. He went to the gym, helped a neighbor with her groceries, stopped to take photos with fans, always smiling but saying little about what had happened. He didn't post again, didn't comment on the leak, and didn't correct anyone's version of the story. His silence wasn't avoidance, it was intention. When his closest friend, an old stuntman named Mike, finally visited him at home, he found Keanu sitting on his porch, drinking coffee. Mike leaned against the railing and said, "You know, you could end all the noise with one interview, one good statement." Keanu smiled faintly, his gaze on the horizon. "Maybe," he said, "but truth doesn't need my defense." Mike nodded slowly. "You think she'll be okay?" "The host, I mean." Keanu took a long breath. "I hope so," he said. "She just forgot that light can hurt when you've been sitting in the dark too long." In the days that followed, something remarkable began to happen. The conversation that had started as outrage slowly turned into reflection. People weren't just reacting anymore, they were questioning. What made his silence so powerful? Why did a moment with no shouting, no victory pose, move millions more than any debate ever had? Every major talk show brought in experts to explain it. One psychologist described Keanu's stillness as emotional, grounding, saying, "When someone stays calm in the face of attack, it creates what we call cognitive dissonance. The aggressor loses control, and the observer feels empathy." Another analyst added, "He didn't try to convert her. He didn't even try to win. He simply lived what he believed." That's the rarest kind of conviction. Clips of his silence were slowed down and studied frame by frame. News anchors replayed the moment he touched the cross at his neck and kept his eyes lowered, calling it the gesture that silenced a generation of cynics. In classrooms and workshops, teachers played the footage to show the difference between reacting and responding. Even corporations used the video in leadership seminars. Then came the ripple effect. A journalist from Brazil posted, "We've seen enough anger. Maybe this is what peace looks like." A teacher in Ohio wrote, "My students used to laugh at faith. Yesterday, they sat quietly after watching the clip." A therapist shared, "One of my patients who'd stopped praying for years told me, 'If Keanu can believe again, maybe I can too.'" Churches began holding gatherings where people rewatched the broadcast, not as entertainment, but as meditation. In small community halls and cathedrals alike, silence filled the air before someone would whisper. That calm, that was real. Some people cried, others prayed, others simply sat there, breathing. Even secular voices couldn't deny it. A popular podcast host known for mocking religion said on air, "I've made a career out of tearing down what people believe in." But what he did, it wasn't about belief. It was about grace, his co-host replied. "Maybe that's what we're missing, grace." Online, the tone changed too. The anger toward Madeline began to soften. Videos circulated showing her tearful confession on stage, her trembling hands. People began writing comments like, "Maybe she wasn't the villain. Maybe she was, just lost." Another said, "He didn't shame her. He showed her mercy. That's what made it beautiful." By the end of the week, what had started as scandal became movement. People began posting photos of small crosses, candles, and journals with captions that read, "Faith doesn't need volume." The hashtag #QuietStrength began trending, overtaking political debates and celebrity gossip. Through it all, Keanu remained silent. His friends said he read the headlines but rarely reacted. When asked by his publicist if he wanted to release a statement thanking the public, he shook his head. "No need," he said quietly. "If it's real, it doesn't need repeating." A photo surfaced of him days later, walking down a quiet Los Angeles street, wearing his usual dark coat, a coffee in hand, the small cross faintly visible against his chest. A fan who spotted him asked gently, "Do you ever get tired of people asking about faith?" He smiled with that same peaceful warmth and answered, "Not when they're asking to find it." That single sentence spread across the internet, quoted on billboards, tweets, and sermons. People said it wasn't just an answer, it was an invitation. And for the first time in a long while, the world wasn't laughing or shouting. It was listening. Madeline Cole vanished. One day, she was everywhere, headlines, hashtags, debates, and the next, she was gone. Her social media accounts went silent. The talk show went on hiatus without announcement. Journalists speculated that she'd been fired, that she was hiding, that she couldn't handle the backlash. For weeks, the noise swirled without a trace of her voice in it. Inside her apartment, the curtains stayed closed. She didn't turn on the TV. The notifications on her phone stacked up into the thousands, unread. Some messages were cruel, some forgiving, but all of them felt like echoes from a world she no longer belonged to. She avoided mirrors, avoided the sound of her own voice. Every replay of that interview lived in her mind, especially the moment when Keanu looked at her not with anger, not even with pity, but with understanding. One night, she scrolled through the trending clips again. The comment sections had changed tone. People weren't mocking her anymore. They were wondering what had broken inside her that night. Someone wrote, "I don't think she was being cruel. I think she was crying for help." Another said, "He didn't destroy her, he freed her." Madeline closed her laptop and sat in the dark. For years, she had built a career on questions that cornered others, but now, the only question left was for herself. Who was I really trying to expose? Weeks passed before she found the courage to speak again. When she did, it wasn't from a studio. There was no team, no lighting, no script. It was just her sitting in her kitchen, her phone propped against a coffee mug, recording on a shaky camera. No makeup, no filters, just a trembling woman who had spent weeks sitting with silence. "Hi," she began softly, her voice cracked from disuse. "It's Madeline. I don't even know if I should be talking right now, but I think I need to." She looked down, exhaling. "I've read everything, every insult, every defense, every pan's opinion. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to respond. I wanted to understand." She paused, her eyes glistening. I mocked faith because I was afraid of it. I mocked people who believed because I wanted to believe and couldn't. I told myself that hope was weakness, that silence meant absence. But that night, she stopped again, her voice shaking. That night, he didn't fight me. He saw me. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "He saw me." Madeline took a long, unsteady breath before continuing. I didn't understand what silence could do until it surrounded me. For years, I filled every second with noise. I thought being loud meant being right. But when he sat there, and I couldn't make him angry, it was like looking into a mirror I'd been avoiding my whole life. Her words came slower now, heavier with emotion. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't even try to correct me. He just listened. And when he said that no one who suffers while praying is ever alone, I realized that maybe I'd been the one praying all along. I just didn't recognize it because my prayers came out as laughter, sarcasm, and fear. She brushed at her tears, managing a fragile smile. You know what's strange? I used to mock people who cried during moments like this. I used to call it weakness, but now I see it for what it is, release. She looked straight into the camera, her eyes raw, unguarded. If you watched that interview, you saw me at my worst. You saw me try to humiliate a man whose kindness I didn't understand. And you also saw what happens when grace walks into a room that doesn't deserve it. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. I thought I was in control that night. I thought I was running the show. But looking back, I think something bigger was happening. Something I couldn't see, because I was too busy trying to prove I didn't need faith. But maybe faith doesn't ask for proof. Maybe it just waits for us to stop fighting. She went quiet for several seconds, the only sound in the video, the faint hum of her refrigerator. Then she whispered, "He taught me that silence isn't absence. It's presence." Maybe it was never God who stopped speaking. Maybe it was me who stopped listening. Her eyes lifted again, steady this time. To anyone I hurt that night, to people of faith, to people who believed when I didn't, I'm sorry. I mocked what I didn't understand because I thought understanding was the same as control, but I was wrong. She gave a small, trembling smile. I don't know what I believe yet. I'm not here to preach, but I know this. If love exists, if grace exists, it looks a lot like the man sitting across from me that night. Her last words were barely audible. Thank you, Keanu, for not fighting back. The video cut out suddenly, not with a polished fade or logo, but with the quiet click of her phone camera stopping. Within hours of being posted, the video spread across every platform. Viewers called it the most genuine apology they had ever seen. The internet that had once ridiculed her now embraced her vulnerability. Comments flooded in by the millions. We've all mocked what we don't understand. This is what healing looks like. She didn't lose the argument she found herself. By the next morning, the video broke every record on streaming platforms. 100 million views in less than 24 hours. News anchors played clips of her confession, pausing to wipe tears from their own eyes. Faith leaders across the world quoted her closing line. Maybe silence isn't absence. Maybe it's presence. Those words were printed on t-shirts, shared in devotionals, painted on church walls, and turned into songs. Even people who didn't believe in anything found comfort in them. It wasn't about religion anymore, it was about recognition. And as the world watched Madeline's redemption unfold, something else began to shift. The conversation that had once been about one man's calm was now about everyone's search for meaning. For the first time in years, people didn't just want noise, they wanted stillness. 2 weeks after Madeline's heartfelt confession, the world was still talking about it. Her video had turned from scandal to symbol, and every major network wanted a follow-up. Ratings teams saw numbers they hadn't seen in a decade. But more than numbers, something deeper had shifted. People weren't tuning in for gossip anymore. They were searching for something that made them feel again. Inside the network headquarters, executives sat around a long glass table watching the replay of Madeline's video for the 10th time. The head of programming, a gray-haired man named Richard Hale, leaned forward, tapping his pen. This wasn't just television, he said quietly. This was transformation. And we missed it the first time because we were chasing clicks. An assistant spoke up. The audience isn't laughing anymore, sir. They're listening. They're moved. Richard nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time we give them something worth listening to. He paused before adding, reach out to Keanu. See if he'd consider a second conversation with no scripts, no cues, no manipulation. Just truth. The room fell silent. Everyone knew how impossible that sounded. But by the next morning, a message had been sent to Keanu's management team. We'd like to host a follow-up this time, on your terms. When his manager told him, Keanu was quiet for a long moment. He didn't ask about ratings, contracts, or cameras. He simply asked, why? They said people are ready for something real, his manager replied. Keanu nodded thoughtfully, then looked down at the small silver cross resting against his shirt. If they really want truth, he said softly, then no scripts, no production tricks, no traps. His manager smiled faintly. I'll tell them that's your only condition. 2 days later, the announcement was made. The network released a single poster online, a black background with white text that read, Keanu Reeves and Madeline Cole, a conversation that changed the world. There was no tagline about controversy or conflict this time, only a quiet invitation. Within hours, the internet exploded again. Tickets to the live audience taping sold out in 20 minutes. Lines formed outside the studio for standby seats. People brought candles, crosses, prayer beads, even handwritten letters. News crews described the scene as a gathering of hope. For the first time, fans weren't showing up to laugh. They were showing up to listen. The night before the event, the studio looked nothing like it had the first time. Gone were the bright neon banners, the sarcastic taglines, the artificial tension. The lighting crew replaced the harsh spotlights with a soft amber glow. The walls, once plastered with flashy graphics, were left clean and simple. Rows of seats were arranged closer to the stage, giving it the intimacy of a conversation rather than a spectacle. Even the sound engineers spoke in quieter tones, as if the room itself demanded respect. Madeline arrived hours before the broadcast, wearing plain clothes and no makeup. She stood on the stage alone, staring at the empty chairs, the microphones, and the faint reflections bouncing off the studio floor. Her hands trembled as she touched the desk where she once sat opposite Keanu, the place where her old self had crumbled in front of millions. When the producer approached, she turned. I want no teleprompter, she said firmly. No cue cards, no direction. Just us. He nodded without hesitation. That's what he asked for too. Her eyes softened. Then maybe this time, we'll get it right. Outside, the street filled with people waiting. The network had only planned for a small audience, but hundreds gathered anyway. Some held signs with messages like, Grace wins, Faith is still beautiful, and Stillness speaks. Reporters tried to capture interviews, but most people refused to talk. They said they weren't there for a story, they were there for peace. As showtime neared, a hush fell over the crowd. When Keanu arrived, there were no camera flashes, no shouting fans. People simply stepped aside as he walked in, dressed in his familiar dark suit, his expression calm, almost meditative. He stopped to greet a few audience members, shook hands, smiled softly, and made his way to the stage. Madeline met him there. The moment their eyes met, something in the room shifted. The audience felt it too. There was no tension, no resentment, only quiet recognition between two people who had faced the world's judgment and their own. Welcome back, she said softly as they took their seats. He nodded. It's good to be here. The cameras went live, but it didn't feel like television. It felt like something deeper. The opening shot showed both of them sitting across from each other. The same table between them, but this time, no barriers. Madeline began with a slow breath. The last time we were here, she said, I thought faith was a fairy tale. I thought silence meant weakness. But I learned more from your silence that night than from anything I've ever read. Keanu looked at her gently. It wasn't my silence. he said. It was the space we both needed to hear something else. The audience sat motionless. Every word carried weight. Madeline smiled faintly through glassy eyes. You were right about one thing, she whispered. Silence doesn't mean no one's there. It means you're being given time to listen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was calm, sacred even. Keanu glanced toward the crowd, his voice steady and kind. I think the world's forgotten how to listen. We fill the silence because we're afraid of what it might tell us. But sometimes, what we need most is to stop defending ourselves long enough to feel again. Madeline nodded slowly. That's what I want this conversation to be, she said. Not about religion, not about winning or losing, just feeling again. The audience broke into soft applause, not loud or wild, but reverent. Even the camera operators blinked back tears. As the show continued, the questions weren't interviews, they were reflections. They spoke about grief, forgiveness, purpose, about what it meant to find strength without needing control. Every sentence seemed to lift another layer of pain from the collective room. Outside, millions watched live across the world. Cafes, churches, schools, and even airports streamed the broadcast. People stopped what they were doing just to listen. For 1 hour, humanity slowed down together. When the final minutes approached, Madeline asked quietly, if you could tell the world one thing about what we've all learned through this, what would it be? Keanu looked thoughtful for a moment, then answered simply, that love doesn't shout. It shows up. It forgives. It listens. Madeline's lips trembled. She looked around the studio, then back at him. And faith? He smiled gently. Faith is what helps you keep showing up, even when no one's watching. The audience rose to their feet, not cheering, but clapping softly, tears streaming down their faces. It wasn't the ending of a show. It was the beginning of something else, a moment of stillness the world didn't know it needed. As the cameras faded out, the final image showed Keanu and Madeline sitting quietly in the glow of soft light. No music, no applause, just presence. The second broadcast began under the same lights, on the same stage, with the same cameras that had once captured mockery and humiliation. Yet this time, something unseen had shifted. The air itself seemed softer, the applause reverent instead of raucous. People weren't here to be entertained. They were here to witness. Madeline stepped onto the stage first, her heart pounding in rhythm with the low hum of the audience. The crowd greeted her not with cheers, but with a gentle wave of applause, the kind reserved for someone who has survived something and come back wiser. She smiled faintly, humbled. There were no jokes, no rehearsed lines, no ego, just gratitude. Then Keanu appeared. The audience rose to their feet instantly, not in celebrity worship, but in silent respect. He walked with his usual quiet confidence, dressed simply, the small silver cross glinting faintly under the studio lights. As he reached the table, Madeline stood and extended her hand. The cameras caught the brief, genuine warmth in their exchange. Welcome back, she said softly. Thank you, he replied. His tone was calm, steady. The room, filled with hundreds, somehow felt small, intimate. They both sat. The air between them was thick with meaning, not tension. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Madeline began. You could have condemned me, she said. Her voice wavered slightly, emotion pressing at the edges of her words. You could have humiliated me back, but you didn't. Why? Keanu leaned back slightly, eyes gentle, hands folded. Because forgiveness teaches more than judgment, he said. And because we don't heal by throwing stones. We heal when someone chooses to put them down first. The audience sat in complete stillness. No coughs, no whispers. Just silence that stretched long enough to feel holy. Madeline took a slow breath. That night changed my life, she admitted. I didn't plan any of it. I was supposed to provoke you. But instead, you showed me grace when I least deserved it. He gave a small nod. You didn't need to deserve it, he said quietly. That's what makes it grace. Her eyes shimmered under the soft light. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. And then the unexpected happened. Just as Madeline opened her mouth to continue, the lights flickered. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a breath moving through the room. Then the monitors behind them glitched briefly, their blue hue dissolving into white static before stabilizing again. The audience stirred, unsure whether it was a technical issue or something else. Madeline looked up instinctively. The sound crew exchanged nervous glances. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the flickering stopped. The studio lights steadied, but the air charged and heavy remained. Keanu didn't move. His fingers brushed lightly against the cross around his neck, his face serene. Madeline whispered, "Did you feel that?" He looked at her, calm as ever. "Sometimes," he said softly, "truth makes the world stop, just long enough to listen." The crowd sat frozen. No one clapped, no one spoke. Even the stage lights seemed to hum differently, softer, as though something unseen had brushed through the room and left it changed. The air was thick with emotion, but no one could explain why. Madeline glanced toward the audience, then back to Keanu. "What was that?" she asked, her voice low, reverent. He smiled faintly. "Maybe it was a reminder," he said, "that not everything we feel needs to be explained." Her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in her career, she didn't need to fill the silence. She let it stay. And that silence grew into something powerful, something that held everyone together in stillness. Then, almost as if the lights themselves were breathing, the studio brightened again. The energy shifted, not tense, but peaceful. The audience exhaled collectively, a soft sigh that rippled through the rows of seats. A woman in the front wiped away tears. A man beside her clasped his hands, as if in prayer. Madeline turned back to Keanu, her expression tender. "You said once that faith isn't about seeing," she said quietly. "I think I finally understand what you meant." Keanu nodded. "It's not about proof," he said. "It's about presence. Sometimes what we can't explain is what we need most to feel." The camera zoomed in gently on the two of them. No music played, yet the moment carried its own rhythm. Even those watching at home could sense it, that strange union of peace and awe. Madeline took a steady breath. "When I made that video," she began, "I was terrified. I didn't know how people would respond. But instead of hate, I saw compassion. People shared their own stories of loss, of belief, of trying to listen again. It made me realize maybe this whole journey wasn't about being right or wrong. Maybe it was about being honest." Keanu's expression softened. "Honesty is where faith starts," he said. "Not in perfection, not in certainty, just in admitting what hurts and choosing to keep walking anyway." The audience nodded quietly, moved. The moment felt communal. Everyone connected by something that didn't need words. Madeline looked down for a moment, then back up. "You know, I used to think I was fearless because I questioned everything. But real courage," she said, voice trembling slightly, "is sitting in front of what you can't control and saying, 'I'm still here.'" Keanu smiled. "That's faith too." A hush fell again, but it was no longer heavy. It was comforting. You could feel the unity in the room, strangers breathing in sync, sharing a single emotion neither religion nor reason could name. Then a child's voice echoed softly from the back row. "Mom, why is everyone quiet?" The room chuckled gently, the tension breaking into warmth. Keanu looked toward the bro sound, smiling. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "quiet means you're in the presence of something good." The audience applauded, not wildly, but sincerely. It was applause that came from gratitude, not entertainment. Madeline brushed a tear from her cheek. "I don't think this show is mine anymore," she said. "It belongs to everyone who watched it and found something they thought they'd lost." Keanu nodded slowly. Then maybe it finally became what it was meant to be. As the broadcast neared its end, the lights dimmed to a gentle glow. The two sat facing each other, surrounded by stillness. a soft halo of quiet light wrapping around them. Madeline whispered, "Do you think moments like this happen for a reason?" Keanu looked thoughtful. "Maybe they happen so we remember that grace still exists even on live television." The audience erupted once more, standing now, clapping through tears. And somewhere behind the cameras, a technician whispered, "I think we just witnessed something holy. It happened so suddenly that no one could have prepared for it." One moment, the conversation between Keanu and Madeline flowed like a river, gentle, honest, alive. And the next, everything stopped. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. The giant studio screens glitched to static before collapsing into darkness. The microphones hissed, and then went silent. The studio, normally filled with the hum of technology and the faint buzz of air vents, fell completely still. Not a single sound remained. The audience froze in their seats. The crew stood motionless behind the cameras, and Madeline's words, half-spoken, hung suspended in the dark like a memory. For 10 long seconds, time itself seemed to pause. Only one figure remained visible. A faint, amber glow from the emergency lights cast a soft ring of illumination around Keanu. He sat perfectly calm, his posture unshaken, his face serene. The cross around his neck caught the dim light and reflected it faintly, glowing like a quiet ember in the dark. Madeline looked around, her heart pounding. "What's happening?" she whispered, but her voice didn't carry far. No one answered. The control room's windows were black, the monitors dead. All power was gone, but no one moved. No panic, just stillness. The seconds stretched endlessly. The audience didn't even dare to whisper. Some instinct, deeper than fear, held them in their seats. It wasn't the kind of silence that makes people nervous. It was the kind that demanded reverence. Something unseen, something impossible to name, seemed to move through the room like a breeze without air. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply lowered his eyes for a moment, as if in silent prayer. The glow around him seemed to steady, reflecting faintly off the metal of his cross. His calm presence became an anchor in the void, holding everyone steady while the rest of the world forgot how to move. Madeline's trembling hands pressed against the table. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel her breath shaking. Yet beneath the fear was something else, a strange, unmistakable peace. It wasn't the peace of safety or understanding. It was the peace that comes when you finally stop trying to control what's happening. A man in the back row pressed his hands together without realizing it. A woman began to cry silently, her tears falling onto her lap. Somewhere in the dark, someone whispered a prayer. 10 seconds of perfect stillness. 10 seconds where no one spoke, no one argued, no one performed, only being, only presence. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the lights blinked back to life. The studio came back to life with a soft electric hum. The lights flickered before stabilizing. The monitors glowed again, and the microphones let out a faint hiss as sound returned. But no one moved. It was as if everyone was afraid to break what had just happened. The silence that had filled the room was still hanging there, like incense after a prayer. Madeline blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she looked around at the audience. Hundreds of faces frozen in awe, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and reverence. She turned to Keanu, her hands trembling slightly on the desk. "I don't," she began, her voice breaking. "I don't know what that was." Keanu looked at her with gentle certainty. "It wasn't about winning a debate," he said softly. "It was about touching a soul." Her lips parted, but no words came. The studio was utterly still, waiting for her to respond. Tears filled her eyes as she tried to steady her breathing. "It felt like something moved through the room," she whispered. "Like everything stopped, and yet she struggled for words. I've never felt so alive." He nodded. "Sometimes," he said, "the world goes quiet just long enough for us to hear what we were meant to feel." The audience sat motionless. Some clutched their hands together. Others simply stared at him, their eyes glistening. A man in the second row whispered to no one in particular. "I felt it too." Another nodded slowly, murmuring, "That wasn't just a blackout." Madeline turned to the audience, her voice shaking. "Did anyone else feel that?" Dozens of heads nodded in silence. One woman near the front wiped her eyes. "It wasn't fear," she said quietly. "It was peace." Keanu leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "There's a kind of stillness," he said, "that reminds us we're not as separate as we think." For a moment, everyone in this room was connected by the same silence. No anger, no noise, just presence. Madeline's tears spilled freely now. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "It's strange," she whispered, "how a moment without sound can say more than all the years I've spent talking." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's the language most people forget how to speak." The cameras were rolling again, but no one behind them spoke. The crew moved slowly, reverently, aware that they were capturing something that couldn't be replicated. The director in the control room didn't cut away or cue commercials. He simply let the feed run. Madeline composed herself enough to speak again, her tone soft, fragile. "When the lights went out, I thought something was wrong. But now I think maybe it was supposed to happen. Maybe it wasn't a mistake." Keanu met her gaze. Maybe it was grace, reminding us that it doesn't need an explanation. She nodded through her tears. "Grace," she repeated quietly. That's what it felt like. The audience broke into quiet applause, not the kind meant to celebrate a performance, but the kind that rises naturally when people experience something sacred together. A man stood up near the back, his voice gentle. "I came here tonight because I lost my faith years ago," he said. "But whatever that was, it felt like it found me again." The crowd turned toward him. Madeline smiled weakly, overcome. Keanu gave a small nod, his voice steady. "Sometimes, faith doesn't need to be chased. It just needs a moment to be recognized." No one said another word after that. The broadcast faded out not with theme music or credits, but with the quiet image of Keanu and Madeline sitting together beneath the softened lights. The cross around his neck caught one last reflection, a faint shimmer of gold before the screen faded to black. For those who watched it live, it was 10 seconds of silence. But for many, it became the moment they began to listen again. By morning, the world was talking about only one thing: those 10 seconds of silence. The blackout clip had spread across every major platform, translated into dozens of languages, slowed down, analyzed, dissected, and replayed millions of times. In less than 12 hours, it became the most viewed moment in broadcast history. News anchors called it the 10 seconds heard around the world. Some treated it like a mystery, others like a miracle. Analysts debated what had happened. Was it a power surge, a malfunction, or something else entirely? Scientists filled news panels explaining the probability of a synchronized system failure. Yet their explanations never quite settled the public's restlessness. Because even those who didn't believe in anything beyond logic admitted they had felt something in that silence. Clips flooded timelines everywhere. One camera operator's angle showed the faint reflection of Keanu's cross glowing in the emergency light. Another captured the tears rolling down Madeline's face as she whispered, "I don't know what that was." People slowed the footage to frame-by-frame precision, as though answers were hidden in the pixels. They weren't searching to understand it anymore, they were searching to relive it. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to discussing it. "We live in a world addicted to noise," one host said. And for 10 seconds, the world stopped talking and just listened. His co-host responded softly, "Maybe that's why it mattered." Religious communities around the world called it a divine sign. Churches replayed the silence at the beginning of sermons, inviting their congregations to sit with it. Mosques, temples, and meditation centers did the same, calling it a shared moment of stillness beyond doctrine or language. Atheists and scientists joined the conversation too, not dismissive this time, but thoughtful. One astrophysicist tweeted, "Science may call it coincidence, but emotion calls it connection." A philosopher from London wrote, "Maybe the universe doesn't need to shout to remind us it exists." The hashtags began multiplying by the hour. Number faith in silence. Number grace moment. Number 10 seconds of peace. Even corporations started pausing their ads for 10 seconds of black screen tagged simply with, "Remember the silence." But what struck people most was that Keanu himself said nothing. No interviews, no appearances, no explanations. His social media remained blank, except for one quiet image. The same cross resting on a closed book, sunlight catching its edge. Underneath, a single caption read, "Still listening." That post alone reached over 100 million likes in less than a day. And somewhere in all the noise that followed, something extraordinary began to happen. People started scheduling moments of silence in workplaces, classrooms, even city events. Some did it for faith, others for peace, but everyone agreed it felt right. Across continents, for 10 seconds at a time, humanity remembered how to be still. In the following days, what had started as a television broadcast evolved into a cultural awakening. Entire news cycles shifted their tone. Anchors who usually competed to speak the loudest began starting their segments with a moment of silence. It wasn't corporate branding, it was reverence. Those 10 seconds had shaken the world's rhythm and reminded everyone what quiet could feel like. Late-night comedians paused their jokes to reflect on it. "It's weird," one said to his audience, "but I watched that silence like 10 times, and each time it made me calm. Since when does a blackout do that?" The crowd laughed gently, not mockingly, but in shared understanding. Another host said, "We've seen people go viral for shouting, but maybe this is the first time someone changed the world by saying nothing." Media studios ran round-the-clock coverage of the phenomenon. Analysts pointed out how heart rates of live audiences had synchronized during those 10 seconds, something measurable, recorded on wearable devices. A neurologist explained on morning television, their brains entered a collective alpha state, the same pattern we see during deep meditation. "It's rare for a group that size to experience that at once." Her co-host replied quietly, "Maybe that's why it felt holy." Psychologists wrote papers about communal stillness. Faith leaders called it evidence that humanity still yearned for connection. Even skeptics who dismissed supernatural explanations agreed that something deeper than science had occurred. They didn't have to agree on why it was enough to admit it had happened. Clips of people reacting to the silence began to circulate. In one video, a firefighter in New York stood in his station locker room saying, "We see chaos every day, but for 10 seconds, that room reminded me of peace." In another, a teacher in India showed her students the moment before class and told them, "This is what it sounds like when people stop arguing." The children sat quietly, eyes wide, listening as if to something sacred. Soon, entire cities began honoring the moment. Billboards displayed a countdown, 10 seconds for grace. At noon each day, traffic lights in parts of Europe briefly paused, synchronized to let pedestrians stand still together. Churches rang bells, offices turned off machines, and schools dimmed their lights, all for 10 seconds of global silence. It wasn't an event anymore. It was a ritual. Online, millions began sharing stories about what those 10 seconds had meant to them. "It made me call my mother again," one comment read. "It reminded me that peace still exists." Another wrote, "I don't believe in God, but I believe in what I felt watching that." Even politicians, usually divided by ideology, referenced it in speeches. One senator said, "In 10 seconds of darkness, we saw more unity than in 10 years of debate." The room applauded not out of agreement, but because the words felt true. Meanwhile, Keanu remained invisible. The more the world obsessed over the meaning of the moment, the quieter he became. Paparazzi who followed him described him as unchanged, still walking to his favorite cafe, still smiling at strangers, still offering his seat on the subway. He didn't seem interested in explaining what had happened. And that somehow made it even more profound. A journalist who finally caught up with him outside a bookstore asked, "Mr. Reeves, do you think what happened was divine?" Keanu smiled gently, tucking his hands into his coat pockets. "I think it was human," he said. "And maybe that's close enough." Then he walked away, leaving the reporter speechless. That clip became the closing note in news reports around the world. Anchors replayed it with subtitles, pausing after his final words. Viewers commented that the quiet after his answer felt almost as moving as the blackout itself. And as days turned to weeks, those 10 seconds of stillness never faded from memory. They became a universal language proof that peace didn't belong to any one faith, country, or person. It belonged to everyone who had the courage to stop for a moment, breathe, and listen. The clip of silence had become a mirror for humanity. People around the world found themselves watching it not to understand what had happened, but to see what they had forgotten within themselves. In a children's hospital in Chicago, a small boy with tubes connected to his arms stared at the screen. His mother sat beside him, brushing his hair gently as the blackout replayed. When the lights dimmed on screen, he whispered, "That's what calm looks like." The nurse, standing nearby, swallowed back tears. For the first time in months, the boy's heart rate on the monitor slowed naturally. Across the ocean, in a quiet apartment in Tokyo, an elderly man who had long stopped praying dusted off an old Bible that had sat unopened for years. He didn't read it out loud. He just opened it to a random page and rested his hand on the thin paper. "Maybe it's not about answers," he murmured to himself. "Maybe it's about remembering." In Sao Paulo, a young woman who had walked away from religion years ago sat cross-legged in her small studio apartment. The video played on her phone, its glow reflecting in her eyes. As the silence filled the room, she closed her eyes and began breathing slowly. She wasn't praying. She wasn't meditating. She was simply being. When the clip ended, she found herself whispering, "I forgot it could feel like this." In churches, temples, and even corporate offices, people began holding spontaneous moments of quiet reflection. Some called them prayers, others called them pauses. But everywhere, hearts began to soften. The phenomenon wasn't about doctrine, it was about peace. Social media transformed. Arguments under the clip gave way to reflection. Comments turned from cynicism to confession. "I stopped believing in anything when my wife died," one man wrote, "but tonight, I think she would have smiled at that silence." Another wrote, "I don't go to church, but I felt something holy there." Newspapers across the world ran the same headline in different languages, "A moment that united us all." But perhaps the most powerful reactions came not from leaders or celebrities, but from ordinary people rediscovering stillness. A high school teacher in Ohio began starting her morning classes with 10 seconds of quiet. "Not meditation," she explained to her students, "just space to breathe before the noise begins." At first, the kids laughed, but by the end of the week, they waited for it. They didn't know why. It just made the day feel right. It wasn't a revival of religion. It was something quieter, gentler, and more universal. Keanu Reeves had said almost nothing since that day, yet his silence echoed louder than any speech. His quiet faith, unbranded, unforced, unadvertised, crossed borders and beliefs. People from every culture saw themselves in that calm, unshakable stillness. For a world exhausted by division, 10 seconds of peace had become a door back to grace. In New York, a construction worker on his lunch break leaned against a concrete wall, scrolling through his phone. The clip played without sound, as always, yet something in it made him set his sandwich down. Around him, the city thundered with traffic and shouting horns. But for 10 seconds, he simply watched the stillness of that man on stage, the cross faintly glowing beneath the dim emergency lights. When the video ended, he exhaled slowly, almost smiling. "Guess peace can look like that too," he murmured, before putting his phone away and finishing his meal a little slower than usual. In Paris, an artist stood before a blank canvas that had frustrated her for weeks. Her studio was cluttered, brushes dried, inspiration gone. But when she saw Keanu's calm in that flickering light, something unlocked inside her. She picked up a single brush, dipped it in soft blue, and painted a streak that looked like morning sky. By midnight, a new piece hung on her wall, a portrait of silence itself. She titled it The 10 Seconds. In a monastery high in the Italian hills, monks who had rarely touched modern media gathered around an old laptop to watch the clip. When it ended, their abbot, a man who had spent decades in quiet prayer, spoke softly. "For years," he said, "the world has called our silence strange. Today, it has remembered its language." The monks nodded, not in celebration, but in understanding. Across faiths and philosophies, something invisible connected people. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, atheists, and agnostics all shared the same 10 seconds, without judgment or ownership. The silence didn't belong to anyone. It simply existed like wind or sunlight. It was the kind of unity no leader could legislate, no influencer could manufacture. Hospitals reported an increase in volunteer sign-ups. Counselors noticed their patients mentioning peace more than fear. Even online, where arguments usually lived, something shifted. Hashtags about anger were replaced with ones about hope. Number still listening began trending beside number faith in silence. A father in Detroit who hadn't spoken to his son in years called him after watching the clip. There were no apologies, no explanations, just a quiet moment where both breathed and said, "Hey, that was enough." A woman in South Africa shared a story of her husband, a soldier, who had never opened up about his trauma. One night, he watched the 10 seconds in bed beside her. When the lights flickered on the screen, he reached over and took her hand, without saying a word. It was the first time in months he'd done that. Psychologists called it empathic resonance. The world called it awakening. Meanwhile, Keanu continued living as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He went for his quiet walks, smiled at strangers, and rode his motorcycle through the winding California hills. When asked by a close friend why he hadn't spoken about the moment, he said, "Because truth doesn't need my defense." The friend nodded slowly, understanding that the stillness wasn't his to explain, it was everyone's to feel. News outlets still tried to chase him for statements, but his refusal only deepened the mystique. People began printing his quote on shirts and posters. Schools used it in morning assemblies. One small-town pastor even painted it on the wall above his church doors. "Because truth doesn't need my defense." Everywhere, people began rediscovering small rituals of faith. Not in religion, but in presence. A teenage girl in Manila began lighting a candle every night before bed, whispering her gratitude for another day. A bus driver in Dublin paused each morning before starting his route, taking a single breath in silence. A woman in Sydney began journaling again, writing one line each night. "Peace begins when I stop shouting inside." It wasn't a movement. It wasn't planned. It was awakening, slow, quiet, and deeply human. And at its center stood a man who had never asked for followers, never demanded attention, and never preached a single word. He had simply chosen stillness in the face of noise, kindness in the face of mockery, and faith in the face of disbelief. The world hadn't witnessed a miracle. It had witnessed what happens when grace refuses to hide. Madeline Cole sat alone in her dimly lit office long after the last episode of her talk show had aired. The screens that once surrounded her, flashing headlines and ratings charts, were dark now. The mug with her name printed in gold sat untouched beside a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold. She had always believed silence was her enemy, that stillness was a sign of failure. But now, it felt like the only honest thing left. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she drafted the words that would end her career, the same career built on noise, conflict, and control. She typed slowly, deliberately, every sentence feeling like both a confession and a release. "Some conversations are more important than content," she wrote. "Thank you, Keanu." When she clicked post, there was no fear, no trembling, just a deep exhale. She didn't know how the world would respond, and for the first time, it didn't matter. The truth had finally spoken louder than her voice ever had. Within minutes, her post spread like a quiet wildfire. Journalists who had once criticized her tone shared her message with unexpected respect. Comment sections filled with forgiveness, not scorn. "We've all been her," one person wrote. "Lost, defensive, trying to hide pain behind performance. Others echoed the same sentiment. It takes courage to step away. That's real growth. News outlets ran the headline, Madeline Cole ends her show with grace. Morning talk shows replayed her final statement. But this time, there was no debate, just reflection. The host, who had once been known for her sharp tongue, had chosen humility instead. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves said nothing. No press release, no reaction. He continued his quiet routines, stopping by the same coffee shop, walking through the same park, smiling at strangers as if the world hadn't shifted around him. But when night fell, he sat by a window overlooking Los Angeles and scrolled through the flood of posts mentioning Madeline's message. He paused when he saw a photo of her hair loose, eyes soft, the usual layers of makeup gone. She looked human in a way she hadn't before. There was something raw, unguarded, and deeply sincere about her expression. Keanu leaned back, folded his hands, and whispered, "Good." Then he stood, walked to a small wooden table in his living room, and lit a single candle. Beside it, he placed a folded note written in his own careful handwriting. The words were simple: "You were heard." When he posted the photo to his social media the next morning, there was no caption. Just the soft glow of the candle, the folded note, and a shadow of his hand on the table. The image spread instantly across the world, appearing on timelines, television screens, and news feeds. For many, it felt like closure. For others, it felt like beginning again. The man who had once been mocked for his quiet faith had answered not with anger or argument, but with stillness, a mirror of the peace he carried within. The world had never seen silence so complete, or forgiveness so beautiful. The post from Keanu spread across every corner of the internet within hours. But unlike the usual storm of comments and debates that followed viral moments, this one brought an almost reverent quiet. People didn't argue. They didn't demand explanation. They just shared it, each person adding their own reflection, their own story, their own gratitude. Some wrote, "This is how healing sounds." Others said, "Forgiveness can be silent and still change everything." The note, only 4 words long, "You were heard," became a global symbol of grace. Television hosts, journalists, and influencers who usually lived for controversy found themselves lost for words. One newscaster, known for her tough interviews, ended her segment simply saying, "Maybe this is the world's way of saying we're ready to listen again." Madeline read the message from her apartment balcony the next morning. She had stayed off social media since her announcement, unsure how to face the tidal wave of responses, but the candle photo appeared everywhere, on TV, in texts, even on the side of a passing bus. When she finally saw the words, her breath caught. She pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "He didn't just forgive me, he saw me." For the first time in years, tears came freely. Not from guilt, but from release. Across the city, strangers gathered in small circles holding candles of their own. No one organized it, no one planned it, yet somehow, millions participated. Cafes dimmed their lights for 10 minutes. Churches opened their doors without sermons. Even city halls in several countries allowed brief public vigils. People standing in silence, their candles flickering softly. Each flame a reflection of those 4 words, "You were heard." Psychologists began calling it the ripple of stillness. Newspapers printed essays about how compassion had replaced conflict, if only for a moment. Children wrote the phrase on school art projects. Musicians turned it into lyrics. And every act of kindness, every gesture of peace, seemed to trace itself back to that small table in Keanu's home. Meanwhile, Madeline quietly packed her office for the last time. The posters of her show, once symbols of success, looked hollow now. She kept only one thing from her desk, a small silver earpiece the producers used to feed her lines. She placed it in a box and whispered, "No more noise." Before leaving, she wrote a letter to her staff, thanking them for their work and urging them to use their voices for something that builds, not breaks. "The truth," she wrote, "doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. It just needs to be real." Outside the building, reporters waited, cameras ready. But when she appeared, they didn't shout questions. They stood still, microphones lowered. The silence followed her to the curb, where a small crowd had gathered, not fans, not critics, just people who wanted to be present. A woman in the front row handed Madeline a single white candle. She lit it, nodded once, and walked away. That night, Keanu sat again by his window. The candle from his earlier post had burned down to a small pool of wax. He smiled faintly, knowing the circle was complete. He didn't see the millions of lights flickering in cities across the world, but maybe he didn't need to, because somewhere deep down, he already understood silence had spoken louder than every word ever could. The next morning, newspapers in dozens of countries carried the same front-page image: Madeline's candle beside Keanu's note. The headline read, "Silence answered silence." And beneath it, a quote from Keanu himself, taken from years ago, suddenly resurfaced online. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can say is nothing at all." This time, the world finally understood what he meant. The world had changed quietly, almost imperceptibly. No revolutions, no speeches, no shouting in the streets, just a new awareness carried in people's hearts. What began as a confrontation on a talk show had become something far greater, a reminder that compassion and truth can exist without volume. The closing narration began softly, the same way the story had unfolded. Keanu Reeves didn't preach, he didn't argue. He showed that faith is not noise, it's stillness, compassion, and endurance. On the screen, images flickered, one after another. A young boy sat on his hospital bed, his small hands holding a candle, his eyes reflecting the glow. In another scene, an old woman knelt by her window, whispering a prayer she hadn't spoken in years. The world was still divided by beliefs, languages, and histories, but for once, everyone seemed to understand the same emotion: peace. A father, in a quiet kitchen, helped his daughter strike a match. Together they lit 2 candles on the table. The child asked what they were for. The father smiled softly and said, "For listening." The camera lingered as the little girl's face warmed in the glow. Her expression, thoughtful and still. Across continents, strangers gathered in places of silence: a park in Tokyo, a beach in Rio, a rooftop in New York. None of them planned it, yet all of them shared it. 10 seconds of silence, eyes closed, hearts open. Someone filmed it from above, hundreds of people standing still as the city pulsed around them, a living echo of that night on television. The narrator's voice continued. Sometimes the most powerful sermon isn't spoken, it's lived. Sometimes the greatest miracle is a moment of understanding between 2 souls who refuse to hate each other. In one montage scene, Keanu was seen visiting a small shelter. He smiled, carrying boxes of food, greeting volunteers quietly. No cameras followed him there. The image was taken by a bystander and uploaded later, a simple photo that reignited warmth across social media. He hadn't disappeared from the world. He had simply returned to it with peace. The screen faded to another sequence, a small community center hosting an evening of interfaith reflection. A rabbi, a priest, a Buddhist monk, and an imam sat side by side. No arguments, no debate, just shared silence. Behind them, projected on a wall, were Keanu's words: "Sometimes silence is the most powerful answer." The narrator's tone deepened, reverent but tender. In a time when everyone is desperate to be heard, he reminded us that being present is sometimes enough. That faith, whether in God, in humanity, or in the quiet resilience of the heart, isn't weakness. It's strength in stillness. Then came the final image: Keanu walking slowly through a quiet park at dusk. The sun painted the horizon gold, the air gentle and calm. His cross caught the last light, gleaming softly against his chest. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't need to. The world already knew what he meant. As the music swelled, the screen faded to black. The final words appeared, glowing faintly as if written in light itself. Faith isn't weakness, and silence can be holy. The words lingered on the black screen longer than usual, as if even the video itself hesitated to break the moment. Then, softly, the music faded, leaving only the sound of wind and distant church bells. Viewers around the world watched in silence, many with tears in their eyes. In a small town in Nebraska, a retired school teacher whispered to her husband, "He didn't just change her, he changed something in all of us." In another home across the ocean, a teenager who had never gone to church before whispered the same phrase aloud, testing it, believing it. It was more than a story about faith. It was about endurance, grace, and the courage to stay kind in a world that rewards anger. Keanu had done what few could: remind humanity of its shared stillness, its shared capacity to forgive. The narrator's final words carried softly through the closing frames. When the noise fades and the spotlight dims, what remains is the measure of the heart. One quiet act of grace can echo louder than any argument, longer than any fame. The montage deepened doctors in hospital halls, pausing between shifts to bow their heads in quiet prayer. Children lighting candles beside drawings that read, "Peace lives here." Strangers holding hands during a moment of silence at a crowded plaza. None of it was scripted, yet all of it felt connected, as if that single interview had awakened something deeply buried in everyone watching. Then, one last image appeared: Keanu standing before a simple wooden cross, half shadowed by sunset, the wind moving gently through the trees. He closed his eyes, his lips barely moving, perhaps whispering a prayer, perhaps just a breath of gratitude. The narrator concluded with calm certainty. He didn't fight mockery with anger. He didn't answer cruelty with words. He answered it with stillness. And the world listened. The music swelled once more, warm and uplifting, blending piano and strings. The screen dissolved into slow-motion clips of people embracing, children laughing, and candles glowing against the night. It wasn't a victory lap, it was a reminder of something sacred, that even in division, humanity still recognizes light when it sees it. As the final notes faded, the text appeared. Have you ever experienced a moment of silence that changed you? What does faith mean to you, no matter what you believe? Tell us your incredible story in the comments below. Those words invited reflection rather than reaction. And within hours of the video's release, thousands responded, some with stories of healing, others with quiet thank yous, many with tears they couldn't explain. One viewer wrote, "I'm not religious, but I felt something during those 10 seconds. Maybe faith isn't about believing in something unseen. Maybe it's about remembering we still have souls." Another wrote, "He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just reminded me what grace looks like." And among all the comments, one stood out: a simple line that captured the spirit of everything that had happened. Maybe silence really is the language of love. The screen faded for the last time, the music gone, leaving only stillness, pure, peaceful, and infinite.